Lawn enforcement. Stereotypes are something each of us has to shoulder. Yet as pervasive as they are, it's worth remembering that stereotypes don't happen all at once, and they aren't eternal. Italians are an excellent case in point. It wasn't long ago, in American history, before we were garlic-scented, tomato-stained, dough-flipping pizza peddlers, before we were horse head-chopping, deal-making godfathers, before, heaven help us, we were mushroom-chomping, koopa-stomping, mustache-sporting, princess-saving plumbers, Italians were simply known as dirty lowlifes and ignoramuses, a lesson my great-grandfather learned the hard way. Tony crossed the Atlantic at the turn of the century, leaving the boot of Italy to settle in the glove of Michigan. Prior to this faithful ocean voyage, my great-grandfather's name had been Antonio Badalamenti, but at Ellis Island, the final I was dropped in hopes of making it more pronounceable for his fellow Americans. After working hard for several years, Tony had saved enough money to move down to the western side of Detroit and buy himself a new home in a respectable neighborhood. However respectable Tony figured his neighbors might be, they weren't thrilled to learn that an Italian would be moving in with his wife and 5 kids to live among them. Heated muttering and the shaking of heads prevailed as Tony's new house was constructed, but they were decent enough to leave well enough alone. The neighbors consoled themselves that as far as inferior heritage went, you could still do a lot worse than Italians. One individual, however, was willing to go a step further. Tall and white-haired, in his early 30s, Lieutenant Saw was every bit as hard and steely as the tool that shared his name. He was also a terribly nosy man. Everybody's business was his business. While it's impossible to say whether Saw was actually more bigoted than his peers, he alone was willing to act upon his bias. The morning Tony moved into his new home, Lieutenant Saw paid Tony a neighborly visit. Tony was setting down some boxes when a knock came at his door, and he answered it to find Saw milling about on his front porch. Very few people, even law-abiding citizens, have the self-assurance to not find a uniformed officer at their doorway disquieting. "Good morning, officer," Tony said. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" "Why, have you done anything I should know about?" Lieutenant Saw asked. Tony quickly recollected his activities over the past few days and replied, "No." "Then I suppose you're not." Saw dusted off some paint flakes that had fallen on his hat and said, "I understand that you're new here, Mr. Badalament," Tony offered. "Badal?" Saw grimaced, flashing his teeth. "What's that? French?" "Italian," Tony told him. Saw dragged out a breath. Some consolation, at least. He muttered dully, "As I was saying, you're new here, so I'm advising you to stay out of trouble. You said you're Italian. Now, I don't know how they do things in Little Italy, but I won't stand for any monkey shines around here." Tony smiled. "I'm sure that won't be a problem, officer." "Let's hope not," Saw warned, "for your sake." Tony talked with Lieutenant Saw a while longer, oblivious to the long history of violence behind the man's career, the broken bones and busted organs. Often people Saw arrested had to be sent to the hospital before they did time in a cell. After being nasty and insulting throughout their conversation, Saw concluded that Tony was relatively harmless and unworthy of his time and turned to leave. "By the way," Saw said, by way of parting, "you do well to plant some grass over all this. waving a hand towards the undeveloped soil surrounding Tony's new home. What kind of idiot does he take me for? Tony wondered, resentfully. But instead of voicing this thought, he smiled impishly at the police officer and replied, "No, I figured it'd be a better idea to set up a barn out back and leave the land as is. Makes it better for raising my cows on." Suffice it to say, the joke completely went over the policeman's head, particularly the bit about it actually being a joke. Eyes bulging with horror, Saw spun around and cut a straight path to his station. All that day, Saw relayed the shocking news to all his fellow officers, and when his shift ended later that day, he spread the word to everyone else he knew. "Did you hear?" buzzed Saw. "There's an idiot Italian who just moved in, and he told me, straight to my face, that he was going to be bringing cows to live with him. Actual mooing, cud-chewing cows." The neighborhood was scandalized. "That moron can't bring those lumbering animals to our suburbs," cried the town librarian. "This is Michigan, not Wisconsin. What do you expect from an Italian? Those things will wander straight into oncoming traffic. Cow pies will be everywhere." It took only a short week for Lieutenant Saw to work the community into a frenzied uproar. Everyone agreed they couldn't allow cattle in their town. Saw collected dozens of signatures for the eviction of Tony Badalament. The next morning, a great crowd of concerned citizens led by Lieutenant Saw strode up to Tony's house. What awaited them was a sight for Saw to see. Tony Badalament's lush bent lawn was trimmed to match the crisp fineness of a professional golf green, with roses, azaleas, begonias, and chrysanthemums set in rows along the walkway. To their further astonishment, a set of small metallic spouts extended out from the grass, shooting out spurts of water in a wide circle. "A sprinkler system," sighed one of the women. "I can't believe it." None of them could. Automatic lawn sprinklers were still a top-dollar innovation at this time, and Tony was the only one in miles who had one installed. It was undeniably the best lawn on the block, and not by accident. Tony had gotten wind of the gossiping and had hired a professional landscaper from a local golf course to make sure there was nothing anyone could complain about. "So when will the cows come home?" Lieutenant Saw, someone in the crowd, chided. And to this, Saw had nothing to say. 25 years down the road, Tony was driving along to work one Sunday morning when he happened to spot a familiar face shuffling down the sidewalk. Saw was long retired from the police force and had turned in his badge. Tony pulled over by the crosswalk coming up. "Hey, Saw, where are you headed?" "Church," said Saw. Tony had been acquainted with Saw long enough to know that the man had never owned his own car. "Need a lift?" asked Tony. "You sure?" "Sure, I'm sure." It was a half a mile to church, a long ways walk for any man in the twilight of his years. Saw got in. He was very quiet at first, not even watching the road. He only spoke when Tony had pulled into the church parking lot. "I've got to hand it to you," he said. "All this time, you've always been such a good neighbor, and all this time, I caused you a lot of heartache." "Forget about it," said Tony. "No, forget it. It's in the past." Saw grinned and let himself out of the car, waving at Tony as he pulled away. Moral: jumping to conclusions makes for a good, long fall.